click subscribe and hit that bell notification. 2 Samuel chapter 9. So chapter 9 is a very basic chapter. It's a very simple story. There's not a lot involved with it. So I felt like I needed to complicate it and make it difficult. Hopefully, what I have to say will make sense. There is a lot of physical story, realities that happened in real life with David, Mephibosheth, Ziba, but it really applies to our relationship that we have with God, and it really applies to the relationship that we have in ourselves, being born again and redeemed with a new nature, and then a remaining nature that is corrupt and in deceit. Our flesh will lead us off into sin. And so we're constantly battling with ourselves, the new nature and the old nature. And what I find in this text is you have just that. It is our relationship to God and that internal turmoil that we fight with. And that's going to be represented with Mephibosheth and his relationship to David. David is going to show him grace upon grace upon grace. And then Ziba and Mephibosheth are going to have a very tumultuous relationship, and it's going to be difficult for them to live together, but they have to live together. It is by royal decree that Ziba and Mephibosheth will be bound together for years and years and years. And so they have to get along with each other. But that doesn't stop them from causing each other problems and issues. So, 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, 'Are you Ziba?' And he said, 'I am your servant.' And the king said, 'Is there not still someone of the house of Saul, that I might show the kindness of God to him?' Ziba said to him, 'There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet.'" So verse 1, David asks a difficult question. Why is it difficult that David says, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul?" Why is that not an easy answer to bring to the king? So, as you said, the typical monarchical changeover is that when a new monarch comes into power, they would decimate and destroy the old family, because there might be a hint of rebellion. There might be a hint of loyalty for the old guard, and so the new guard would destroy the old. Now, David has always been very patient and kind and generous to Saul's family, but that doesn't stop people's conceptions of reality. And we know that because Saul was capable of turning almost all of Israel against David. There was a large section in Judah that protected David where he wandered in the wilderness, but a lot of people believed that David was fighting against Saul in the past, even though it wasn't true. And so David vindicated himself over and over and over again. Saul and Jonathan and lots of Saul's children were destroyed in battle with the Philistines. They were killed, and there was a small remnant left over. One of them is this crippled child. And so anybody who would bring an heir of Saul to David would have to assume David wants to kill him. So when David asks this question, there's this lingering doubt in the back of everybody's minds, like he could be saying he wants to do good to them, but is he just going to kill them? Because he's the king. He can do whatever he wants. So the person to answer the question has to be very bold, has to be very particular in what they say. And so everybody says, well, go talk to Ziba. Verse 2, now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. Now, what is Ziba's relationship to Saul? He's a servant to the house of Saul. So when Saul died and everything was left at Saul's house, who was in charge of it? Ziba. He's the servant. You don't call a servant, you call the servant. Who would know about Saul's family? That guy. How do you know he knows? He's Saul's servant. Oh, okay. So he's practically family, because that's how servants work at that time, right? Like, you do divide the household and you say, and then there's the servants, but you are all one household. A good example of this would be Abraham. God said, when you have children, you are to circumcise them. And when you have servants, what do you do with your servants? You circumcise your servants, because you are all part of the covenant. As a group, you are all united. Ziba shows up, and what does he say? Are you Ziba? And he says, I'm your servant. And then what does he say? There is one heir alive, and he's crippled. Most people probably wouldn't be able to answer this. I wouldn't be able to answer this, except for I've been reading this book over and over again. Are there any other surviving members in Saul's house other than this crippled boy, this crippled man? It's shocking to find out in chapter 21, there's over 6 children to Saul that are still alive. So they're not like completely gone. So why pick this one? Why bring up Mephibosheth? I think Ziba knows what he's doing, and I think he knows the risk. And I don't think he would offer somebody that he actually genuinely likes and cares about. I think Ziba is a dirtbag, and we'll find out why later. And he brings Mephibosheth to David, and he selects out of all of the family the outcast. Now keep in mind, especially in Jesus' day, I'm not sure about this day, I haven't studied it too closely, but in Jesus' time, if you were crippled, you were not only an outcast because you're not useful and you're a burden, but the belief is you are being punished by God for a sin that you've committed or the sins of your parents. That's why somebody comes to Jesus and they say, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? That's always the conundrum. People think, God's blessing is that you're rich and powerful. God's cursing, you're poor and broken. Therefore, you're cursed. And so there's lots of reasons why Mephibosheth wouldn't be considered really a big influential part of the family. But what we find out in the next verse is that he doesn't even live with Saul's family. He is removed from the family and he's out on his own. So next we get to Mephibosheth. Verse 4, and the king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodabar. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodabar. So Machir is actually a very kind and generous man. Machir is going to show up later on. This is going to be very important, so I'll explain the story. David is going to have a son who becomes very powerful and influential in Israel, and he actually tries to usurp David on the throne. David has to pick up everybody and everything he cares about, and he flees for his life. He actually leaves Israel and he runs out into the wilderness just to get away from his son. When he is fleeing, Machir comes out to him and gives him things for he and his entourage. He gives him food and donkeys and money and all this stuff that he would need to survive. So he is a very generous man. And Mephibosheth, being crippled, has come into this man's house to be cared for. Machir has been bearing the burden of this man for however long he's been there. We know that he fled for his life when he was 5 years old, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. And when he was 5 years old is when he was crippled. But that was when Saul was killed. When Saul and Jonathan were killed, they ran for their lives believing that David or another party would come to kill them. And so now Mephibosheth is under the care of Machir. And Machir is a very influential man. He's a very wealthy man, but he's also a very gracious and kind man. Jonathan and David had a covenant that said, me and my family will protect you and your family, and our interests will be united. And Jonathan specifically says, you will be king one day. And when you are king, be gracious and kind to my offspring. And so this is a bond of brothers formed in battle, but also a soul-to-soul love for one another, a covenant of familial companionship. My family will be for your family. Verse 6, and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, Behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, That you should show regard for a dead dog such as I. What happened in those verses? Mephibosheth shows up, and then David and Mephibosheth have a conversation. First of all, what does Mephibosheth do? He prostrates himself. He came in and he bowed down. He pretty much lays on the ground. He's an outcast. He's crippled. He's not capable to perform menial tasks for himself. He has to be carried around. He sleeps on a bed. He can't walk. He might have some crutches, some form of like maybe get around, but we don't know. We find out later that when David is fleeing, Mephibosheth is left behind, and there's some betrayal there. And he was incapable of taking care of himself in that scenario where he desired to do something, but was incapable of doing that which he desired. So David tells him, don't be afraid, because kindness is going to be shown to you for the sake of your father. Now, this word kindness is loving kindness. It is mercy. It's translated in a multitude of different words, but the general idea is grace. It is the favor upon somebody else, not because of what they've done, but because of somebody else's desire. Grace comes from David to Mephibosheth on whose account? Who's the reason? Jonathan, his father. Mephibosheth doesn't deserve it. He doesn't earn it, but he receives it. Just like we receive it from God. God gives us grace, not because we've earned it, not because we deserve it, but he does it on somebody else's account. Whose account is it? Jesus. The covenant between the Father and the Son, that we are brought into it, right? They have made a covenant. He has shed his own blood. He has offered himself as a sacrifice so that we could be saved. And therefore, now we can be brought into the family. Grace is restoring what was lost. He says, all that was your father's will be yours. All of Saul's land is now yours. Saul was a king. He had lost everything, but who is in charge of it? David has control over the whole land. What David says, David gets. David does, happens, right? Ziba is in control of the land. Ziba is in control of the inheritance for Mephibosheth. David tells Mephibosheth, I'm going to restore to you what you lost, and you will sit at my table and eat. What does that mean? You're part of the family. Exactly. You live with me. What is mine is yours. When we eat, you eat. When we have fun, you have fun. When we have a party, you have a party. Mi casa, su casa. So David says, not only are you going to receive back what rightfully belongs to you, but you're going to gain much more than you deserve. You will become a part of my family. What does that mean for Ziba? Mephibosheth has hit the lottery. Ziba has lost everything. And this is that battle of the two natures. Verse 9, then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson, and you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. What a turn of events. What do you think Ziba was thinking would happen when he saw the king that day? He thought, pretty good chance Mephibosheth's just going to get ousted, just get killed. Really was trying to take control. And we're going to find out later his manipulative kind of powers. He was trying to take control of the situation. He was trying to be in charge, and he was trying to better himself. And in the end, by seeking to be first, he became last. He became more of a servant, where he kind of exalted himself, I'm sure. When Saul and many of Saul's kids die, who's really in charge? It wouldn't be the young ones. The servants are guardians over the heirs. And we'll read it in Galatians where it says that the guardians rule over the heirs, and while their guardians are over them, they might as well be slaves. Right? They do as they're told. They don't have choices. They can't spend money. They can't build. So Ziba, over the past couple of years, however long it's been, has really been the man in charge. And here is Mephibosheth, who lives on kindness, on graciousness, and he survives at the gratuity of other people. He is now placed at the head, and Ziba must serve him. And he says in verse 11, Mephibosheth will sit at my table like one of the king's children. What do you call it when somebody who's not a part of the family becomes a part of the family? David is adopting Mephibosheth. He is saying, you are equal to a prince in Israel. You who are the least and the lowest and the last, you will sit at my table with me and my children. Verse 12, and Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. Obviously it says, okay, everybody's now become servants. Ziba, congratulations. You're lowered back to your original station. But it says that Mephibosheth has a young son whose name was Micah. Why is that important? The name Micah says, the meaning of it is who is like God, or who is like the Lord. You would get to the end of this story and you would see what's happened to Mephibosheth, and you'd see what's happened with Ziba and David and all this different stuff. And you would just be like, who could orchestrate this? Who could put all this together? Who would take the first and make them last, and take the last and make them first? You know, who is like our God who would do such a amazing thing? I think that's why it's put in there. Because Mephibosheth has lots of children. It's just what people do. How many children did Ziba have? He had 15 kids and 20 servants. 15 children. Children were a big deal, but just to mention one of them, in my mind, the author is really trying to tell us that Mephibosheth is grateful to God for his life. Mephibosheth is humble, and though he is crippled, he trusts in the Lord because he named his child, who is like our God, who is like the Lord Almighty. And then verse 12, so Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. Why would we need to end the story with he was crippled, since it was already known? We caught that earlier from Ziba. Ziba told the king, yeah, he's the crippled guy. There's one who's still alive, he's the cripple. And then we get to the end of the story and it says, now Mephibosheth is a prince. He is seated at the king's table. He comes in and he sits down, and it's as if he's exactly like everybody else, but he still has a weakness. He's still broken. That is that dual nature, that he is exalted yet still humbled. He is a prince, but still lives at grace and mercy lane. He is there by invitation, and the history of his past still clings to him. And it really talks about the duality of us being born again, being brought into the family of God. We've been given a new nature, that we should be like him, that we should grow in holiness and be pure, desire and hunger and thirst for righteousness and goodness and all things that are pure. And yet there's still a frailty. There's still a brokenness, and we're still a cripple. Do you know what it means to be crippled? I looked it up. Definitions. One of them, I took one. It means to be severely damaged. He is not whole, and he is not the way that he was designed to be. And it's just like us. We long for the day of redemption. We long for the day when this broken tent, this body, will put on immortality and put on glory because we still have that touch of brokenness. Our feet are still crippled and we don't do as we want to do and we aren't what we want to be yet. And so Mephibosheth has a brilliant life, a wonderful life, and a great relationship with David, but it's broken. We're going to expand this story. I'm sure we'll cover it, but we're going to cover it in chapter 16. So we have, at least another 7 weeks before we get there. So we know that he was crippled when he was 5 years old. 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4. So he was damaged in the fall. The servant was running with him when he was 5 and fell, and she actually crushed his legs. And that's why he's crippled. Now let's turn to chapter 16, 2 Samuel chapter 16. This is years later. David fleeing for his life from his own son, trying to usurp the throne. And while he was fleeing, lots of people were coming out to him and saying King, we got you. We're on your side, yada, yada, yada. So verse 1, when David had passed a little beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of donkeys saddled, bearing 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 of summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, why have you brought these? Ziba answered, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and the summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who faint in the wilderness to drink. And the king said, and where is your master's son? Ziba said to the king, behold, he remains in Jerusalem. For he said, today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father. Then the king said to Ziba, behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. And Ziba said, I pay homage. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my lord the king. Ziba comes out to David. What's David's first question? What are you doing? What's the second question? Where is Mephibosheth? Why isn't he here? What did he say? Mephibosheth says, vindication. Today I will be made king. Finally, the day that I have waited for is upon me, and now I will rule over David, and I will rule over Israel. Ziba's making this guy to look like a traitor. And so what is David's response? That's it. I'm giving everything back to you, Ziba. Nothing goes to Mephibosheth now. Why would David be so quick to believe in that? David's on the run, he's stressed out. I think Mephibosheth had a very difficult time living out his gratitude for what the king had done for him. He did not feed the relationship with the king. He was given grace upon grace. He was brought in to be a part of the family, but I don't think he lived as though he was part of the family. I don't think he showed his gratefulness. Now, that doesn't mean he's not grateful. It doesn't mean that he didn't appreciate the things that David had done, because we'll find out later what really took place. But what it means is that David did not receive that gratitude. David did not see it because it was not presented to him. And I think Mephibosheth kind of lived that I appreciate what you've done for me on the inside and never expressed it on the outside. He never took physical action based upon the new position that he was given. He was called into the royal palace, but he never filled the role of a prince in the palace. Okay, so let's see the truth behind this. Chapter 19, verse 24, David comes back. Lots of things take place. 19:24. David comes back into Jerusalem to go to his house, and then all these same people are coming out to meet him. And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. And when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king, he said to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? And he answered, my lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go with the king. For your servant is lame. He has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. For all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. but you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I than to cry to the king?" And the king said to him, "Why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziba shall divide the land." And Mephibosheth said to the king, "Oh, let him take it all, since the Lord the king has come home safely." Mephibosheth's side of the story is very different than what Ziba portrayed. Mephibosheth wanted to go. He had a desire to show that gratitude. But when given the opportunity, this other partner deceived him, took advantage of the situation, and he said, "I'm going to saddle the donkey and I'm going to go to the king. I'm going to go ride with him." But he saddled the donkey and left without me. And there's nothing I can do. Like, I'm stuck here. If this guy doesn't help me, what am I supposed to do? I'm crippled. And that's where we talk about the duality of Mephibosheth and Ziba's relationship. They're bound together, one to serve the other. One is greater than the other. Our spirit is to be stronger than our flesh. But boy, does our flesh deceive us. So, oh, that looks nice. That feels nice. That pride of life. All of the desires of the flesh and the pride of this world wages against our spirit. But what is our spirit? It is the master over our flesh, constantly waging war. And so Ziba won the victory one time, and then Mephibosheth came back and expressed his loyalty to the king. And you can see this in the fact that he didn't wash, he didn't clean, he didn't do his clothing. He really was worried about the king, so that he did not take care of himself. And that was the way that he could show the king that he was loyal, that he did care, he was grateful, and he did appreciate everything that the king had done. And it makes me, really press in on the point that you don't recognize what you have until you lose it. Mephibosheth had something great, but he didn't take advantage of participating in that relationship until that relationship was taken from him. And then he had to fight to get it back. 21, verse 7. Chapter 21, verse 7. So this is a secret event we don't know about. At some point, Saul, in his brutality, killed tons of people. He thought he was doing good for Israel, but he wasn't. And so he killed a bunch of Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites had a covenant with the Israelites to be protected. They made a covenant with Joshua. This is when they were deceived. Joshua made a covenant with them when they brought old clothing and ragged stuff, and they acted like they traveled a long way. So Saul broke the covenant and killed the Gibeonites. And there's a famine in the land for 3 years. So David inquires of God, and he says, "Why is there a famine? Why is there no rain? We're not getting what we need." And God tells him it's because of what Saul did to the Gibeonites. So David goes to the Gibeonites and he says, "What do you need as a restitution for what Saul did to you guys?" And they said, "We don't want money, and we don't want the death of Israelites. We want Saul. Give us 7 of Saul's children, and we will kill them." So he does. Verse 7. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, whom she bore to Saul, and it goes on and on. So he took 7 children of Saul. They were all killed, and David's going to have to manage that. But he spares Mephibosheth from the wrath. He protected him. They've had their ups and downs in their relationship, but David's grace guarded Mephibosheth from punishment, from wrath. Though Mephibosheth wasn't a perfect companion for David, though Mephibosheth was the one that was broken and damaged, he was incapable of showing his affection, and maybe he was carrying years and years of wounding, of fear, having to be on the run his entire life. David's grace still would not relinquish Mephibosheth. Still, David blessed him and took care of him and provided for him and protected him. So what applications can we take away from this? Let's look at Galatians chapter 4. Now, this is back to that guardian, slave, heir, son, adoption concept. And so in Galatians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul talks about the customs of the time and how children are not actually heirs until they come of age because they're under a guardian. And he's going to talk about the law. The law is our guardian until we come to Christ, and then we're freed from the law to full maturity, to true heirship. But there's going to be correlations between that guardianship with Mephibosheth and Ziba, and then full adoption into the household of David. So let's read this. Verse 1, I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the day set by his father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. Exactly what happened to Mephibosheth has happened to us. We were slaves to sin. We were slaves under the law. The law said, do not covet, do not murder, and do not commit all of these crimes, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So the law was our guardian to teach us, to guide us. Jesus, born under the law, fulfilled the law, and he redeems us out of it, right? Just like Mephibosheth was born in brokenness, and he was redeemed out of it. He was called out of that place of despair and brought into the household of David. And so we are brought into heirship, we are brought into sonship by Jesus Christ, and we are now a part of God's family. And he has given us the guarantee of his Spirit that makes us cry, Abba, Father. And it's interesting to me, I wonder if Mephibosheth ever really spoke to David kind of that adoration, that love, that affection of gratefulness and appreciation, and looking to David not only as just a leader and a king, but as a father figure. David said, you will be as one of my children. And Mephibosheth is thinking, but I'm not your child. And that's exactly the way it is with God. He says, you will be one of my children. And you're like, well, I'm not technically your child. He's like, no, I've adopted you. I've given you my Spirit. And my Spirit is to cause you to cry out in worship, to look to me as your Father, to give your adoration and your affection and your love to be poured out on me because I've placed my Spirit in you. Any questions? So I think with Mephibosheth, there's more than just physical damage. We've talked about this a little bit. He is wounded, he's insecure, he's fearful, and he's guarded. I don't think he could let his guard down because he was running for his life for most of his memories. He was injured in running through fear, and then he relied on the kindness of other people, but he didn't receive the inheritance of his father. He was treated as an outcast and potentially hunted. Nobody knew where he was except for Ziba, part of the household. Part of the lack of his outward affection led to the deception. The reason why Ziba could deceive, why he could accuse and malign Mephibosheth, is because Mephibosheth wasn't capable of showing that affection. He was kind of guarded. He was like that wounded puppy that wants nothing to do, even though you're trying to feed him. And then a really good one is that Mephibosheth is chosen by grace and he's protected by grace. Why him? It shouldn't be him. Out of all the people, you wouldn't pick him. David wouldn't have picked him. Ziba picked him. Grace elected him for the purpose. He was selected and chosen and brought in to the position that he received purely by grace. It effectually caused him to go from point A to point B. That's grace. And when he failed, because he's broken, just like we are, and when he failed, what sustained that position? Grace. Romans chapter 5. Yeah, we'll read 1 through 2, and then 6 through 11. Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him, we have also obtained access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. So we have obtained grace by faith, and we stand in it, immovable, protected, guarded, shielded. We've been justified. We've been reconciled back to God. We are now a part of his family, and we stand in grace. Verse 6, because while we were still weak or broken or disabled, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since, therefore, we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled, or we now have peace with God by the death of his Son, how much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life? More than that, we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. There was a distance, there was a gap, there was war, there was enmity between us and God. And I imagine Mephibosheth felt enmity and war and wrath towards David. And that all changed when grace extended that kindness to him. While we were still sinners, God showed his love towards us in that Christ died for the ungodly. He made peace, he brought us in, he justified us, he washed us, he cleansed us, he made us a part of the family, and now we sit at the King's table as his children, chosen by grace, protected by grace.